Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today is another series, another part in this series that we titled Systemic Racism: How Boards Can Positively Impact Their Companies and Boardrooms. It's the third part of a four-part series. It's looking at three prominent U.S. segments of the population that have been impacted both in their companies and their boardrooms as far as corporate America goes, and their participation in senior management and on the board of directors. In part three, we're going to be looking at the African American / Black corporate community. And joining me are two people that I have a lot of faith in, that I think can cover this topic well. And the first is Rose McKinney-James, who's a board member with MGM Resorts International and also serves on the board of the Toyota Financial Savings Bank. And along with her, please welcome John W. Rogers Jr., who co-founded the Black Corporate Directors Conference and is also the chairman, co-CEO, and chief investment officer for Ariel Investments. Welcome, Rose and John.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So this is all about keeping the conversation going and not letting us drift back into sort of our old thing where there's nothing happening. There's some discussion, but we don't see action with that. And in our first two parts of this series, we looked at the Asian / Pacific community. And in the second part, we looked at the Latino or Latina / Hispanic community and what was unique about their challenges. Certainly, there were a lot of similarities. And I invite everybody, all our viewers, if you haven't seen those two parts, it sort of sets the foundation for the series. So I welcome you to do that. Also, during this study, I will be sort of making reference to a call to action for equity and inclusion in the boardroom, which was done by the Diverse Corporate Directors Coalition, of which John's organization is part of. And in that, John, I think that the study showed that there was only a 16% inclusion in the board and people of color. And certainly that's not satisfactory when you look at the U.S. population and you look at corporate America and who's buying goods and services. And I mean, there's just all kinds of examples we could give on why that number is not a great number. There's no question that systemic racism is never a comfortable topic, but I think we've all gotten to the point that we understand that it has to be discussed and it has to have action attached to it. So that's sort of what we're here today. So let's start this conversation. And Rose, I'll start with you, but I want to hear both your views of what do you, now that we've had, this certainly brought to the attention, what do you sense is the current landscape with respect to African American / Black inclusion, and what you're seeing as far as discussions among your peers, among the boards? Sort of what's the landscape right now? Rose?
Well, TK, thanks so much. I very much appreciate the topic. And when we look at the landscape, I think what we're looking at is a heightened sense of interest. In some instances, a heightened sense of a need to take some action. But we are working around what has been a very slow pace, a pace that has been now underscored by what we hear around us, this conversation. In my own experience, certainly during the summer, my boards began to, I think, focus more directly on the impact that these conversations had on both our investors and our employees. And as a board, I think we felt a bit of urgency to begin to think about what we needed to do in that regard. Most boards, I think, have been so focused on doing their business that they frequently forget that there are issues that impact their ability to do their business in an effective way. And this is one of them. This is one of those instances where boards and individual directors are beginning to examine their own views, to accept the fact that maybe they come to the table with a certain bias, that they have overlooked the need to really delve into this as an important part of the governance conversation. And so while I see the landscape supporting a bit of ongoing status quo, I'm encouraged. I see around the conversations that are now being engaged in. There are more directors, there are more boards, there are more organizations that focus on board governance that are focused on this issue. And so I'm encouraged, but I'm encouraged in a cautious way.
So how about you, John, from a landscape perspective?
Well, I'm also encouraged. There's a lot happening. My co-CEO, Melody Hobson, and I, we're getting really several calls a week from major corporations interested in having their first diverse board member and want ideas from us. I'm also finding that as a professional investor at Ariel Mutual Funds, when we talk to our management teams like we have now for 37 years about the diversity or lack thereof on their boards, these CEOs are much more willing to listen and seemingly seriously asking for suggestions and ideas. So I think it is a different time. It's a different day. And it's also enhanced by the fact that we have very progressive political leaders now in the Congress. You know, when you have a Maxine Waters as the chairman of the Financial Services Committee of the House of Representatives, they're able to use those bully pulpits to push corporate America to do the right thing.
So I'm very curious, do you see your fellow board members and the people around you more willing to discuss the topic and understand the feelings of that from either of you? Is the conversation becoming easier to have?
Yes, I actually got an inbound call from one of the CEOs of one of the boards that I'm on just this week already. And as I've talked to the three boards that I'm on at Nike, McDonald's, and the New York Times, all the management teams have always been open and willing to discuss these issues, but there's added urgency now. And not only are they interested in the diverse board members that we can help with, but they're also more interested than ever in doing business with African-American firms, giving economic opportunities, and also making sure there's a pipeline of talent for future leadership roles in the management teams. So I'm finding the conversation much, much more comfortable, much more energetic, and people are really truly willing to listen to some of the ideas that maybe we've been talking about for years, but have never quite got the traction you hoped for. Now things are really sort of moving in the right direction.
Yeah, Kika, I would absolutely concur. And I think that's one of the reasons I underscored my view that I'm encouraged by that. The leadership of the boards where I serve have done what I believe is really important, and that is to really lean in on this topic. We have engaged in what we're calling courageous conversations, where we underscore the need to be candid around what is possible, what we have failed to do perhaps in the past, and what we have the opportunity to think about going forward. And in particular, through the lens of our employees. It's so incredibly important to me as a director to know that the engine that fuels our economic activity feels that they are engaged, that they have an opportunity for advancement. So when John talks about pipeline to senior opportunities in the C-suite, a view of how we recruit and where we place our emphasis on talent and retention. and to ensure that we reflect the communities where we conduct business. That has become important and a conversation that is increasingly more comfortable because it happens more frequently.
So in a minute we'll get to suggestions on what boards can do, which is the crux of why we're doing this session. We want to again have our own call to action here, but I want to pose a question to you, both of you. You know, we went through these other sessions, and both the Asian community and the Hispanic community both felt terribly overlooked, okay, in the sense of being considered as candidates, and particularly the Hispanic community, which makes up about 20% of the population. First of all, I need to preface that none of these numbers are good, okay? All of these numbers are poor, but the African American Black community has done, if I could say it, the best job so far in sort of penetrating senior managements and the boardrooms, even though, again, it's poor. But is there anything that you could say to the other groups on why you guys have been more successful, sometimes significantly more successful in penetrating as a group of color than maybe the other groups have? Is there any tricks of the trade, or is there anything that you feel that might have served as a helpful event to you? John, I'll start with you.
Well, a lot of the energy for Blacks on boards happened in the early 70s. You know, my mom, Jewel Lofentant, was an early board member, and you look at some of the giants of those days, like Leon Sullivan and others. It was all goes back to that period, which coincided with the sort of the extraordinary civil rights movement that had such an impact on our country in the 60s. And I think that Dr. King and Reverend Jackson and Andy Young and so many of those dynamic leaders, of course, Congressman John Lewis, helped to shine a spotlight on the way the African Americans were being treated in this country, the lack of equal economic opportunity, the lack of social justice. You know, we saw the videos of people being hosed. We heard the stories of folks being lynched. We saw that we couldn't sit in the front of the bus. We couldn't sit in lunch counters. We couldn't vote in the South. So I think that extraordinary racism and this extraordinary challenge that we face as a community, because of our dynamic civil rights leaders that brought that to the attention of all America, people realized that we needed to be included in everything. You know, Dr. King talked about that. You know, once we can have a chance to vote and sit at the lunch counter, we want to participate in all aspects of our capitalist democracy. And part of that was sitting on the boards of major corporations. So it starts with that energy that came out of the civil rights movement that I think has, you know, helped us have an opportunity maybe to have a few more breakthroughs, even though, as you suggest, the numbers are not nearly what they should be. But you know, so I think that's why we've had so much more attention and so much more opportunity.
Yeah, I just think that's an excellent point, and certainly makes sense. Rose, any thoughts?
Yes, let me point out that while John has focused on the history, and in particular, you know, I think back on the time that he mentions when I was actually in college. But as you fast forward, I'd be remiss if I didn't give credit where credit is due. And part of that goes to John Rogers and Melanie Hobson and other Black leaders for the leadership that they undertook. Having been given the opportunity to penetrate, as you say, the corporate opportunity and serve on these boards, it was through their leadership, and it is manifested in large measure through the Black corporate directors' convenings, to be able to demonstrate, both in terms of numbers and substance, the importance of what an investment in the time and additional due diligence that may be required to identify candidates to participate at this level can actually achieve. I am extraordinarily grateful to them and others who have been very vocal, who have been consistent, And if you want to talk about tricks of the trade, you mentioned in your comments that there is now a more comprehensive set of diversity principles that have come out of the conversations that John and others initially provided to a small group of corporate leaders, Black corporate directors, that has now expanded to be a foundational measure and encourages us, because we have a seat at the table, to be willing to lean in and not to be singularly the only voice, but to encourage additional voices that are going to be required to keep this conversation going.
Thank you. Thank you, Rose, for the comments.
So one of the big challenges is in getting women and people of color on is the slow turnover, on boards. It doesn't give the opportunity for sweeping change, on that side. But nonetheless, there are plenty of opportunities that even now you could say are overlooked, as far as whether it was a Rooney Rule or just recognizing how many candidates of color exist that are certainly qualified to serve on boards. So now I'd like to discuss the most important part of this, and that's sort of what should boards be doing to sort of change the status quo, promote true change in the organization, not only at the boardroom level, but all three of us know that if someone gains a seat in senior management as the CFO or the chief operating officer or the CEO, they're going to get board opportunities. Okay, so what should people in the boardroom, both of color and whites, be doing today to change the status quo?
I guess I'll start, isn't it? I think that one of the things we do at our conference every year is we talk about three principles. We call them the 3 Ps that we hope that African Americans will be leading with when they're sitting in a boardroom. One, which you're hearing a lot about these days, is philanthropy. We want to make sure that money is going to civil rights organizations, historically Black colleges, that will help create the energy to move this movement forward and help create that pipeline that's so important. So philanthropy is a part of it. But the other 2 Ps, I think, are actually more important. Number one, which you've touched on and it's important, is people. And we want to make sure that you're holding your management teams accountable for not only, as Rose suggested, getting the right pipeline in place, but I think it's critically important to have people in those C-suite jobs, some that you mentioned. But most corporations have a management committee. And the vast majority of them, even if they have an African American on the board, have no African Americans on their management committee. So one of the key things that we believe in is we have to get that leader in those leadership roles, because then they become a Pied Piper for talent. I mean, when you have a well-respected senior African American on your management team, more people will want to come and work at your company. People within the company will feel more confident that they're going to be treated fairly and have a chance to rise successfully because they see someone that looks like them at the top of the pyramid. I can't overemphasize how important that is to have that visible person. And the management team has to make sure that they support that visible person and know that they're going to have a lot of demands in their times from the community, from the employee base, from the recruitment process. And so you've got to, again, respect that and admire that and create a culture where that person is celebrated for that leadership role they have. And the last part about people is you want a person in those leadership roles who is well respected in the Black community, that can walk out and talk to a Reverend Jackson or a Reverend Sharpton or a Mark Morial and Cheryl Eiffel, can talk to civil rights leaders as well as political leaders that are in office and have that respect of a broad Black community. So I know that's a lot to ask, but I think that's something that's critically important. If you want to drive change, you have to have people in leadership roles who believe in the civil rights movement and believe in Dr. King's work and understand that discrimination is still a part of our society. And then final P that we have is purchasing. We realize we have to create wealth in our country. We have to create more successes in our country. And we really want corporations to spend money with African-American businesses in everything we do, not just typically the supply chain work that's important, like construction and catering, but we want to be included in the parts of the economy where the wealth and jobs are being created today. In financial services, professional services, and technology, broadly speaking, and to keep track of all the spending by category to help encourage that. And if that happens, as more of us build businesses of scale and size, we will be part of the pipeline for future directors. And it all becomes very much of a virtuous circle. So those 3 Ps are the things that we think everyone can be fighting for within the boardroom.
Rose?
And so as a Black director, the opportunity to really provide some transparency around what John has outlined has been an interesting journey. When we think about the need to embed this in the work that we do as directors, to see it through our lens of oversight, the chance to really dig deep into our strategy around procurement, around people in pipeline, and how we invest our philanthropic dollars creates a foundation for an incredibly, I think, rich conversation throughout the organization. And that's what we've been able to do, at least with the MGM board, is to truly focus on that, to get the buy-in from the CEO. It is a top-down, bottom-up conversation, to have engagement from the employees, because we are talking about economics. Fundamentally, we're talking about economic empowerment, and we're also talking about opportunity. And through that, I've noted, given my role as the chair of our CSR committee for MGM, that the platform of ESG has become a basis for having those conversations. Because going back to the notion of transparency, the requirement that we have these disclosures and that we report out on the work that we're doing is creating some additional scrutiny. That scrutiny now creates some additional energy around the need to make sure that the image that we're projecting is one that our investors support and all of our stakeholders support. So I see a changing landscape, an incredibly hopeful moment that we are seizing. And if we are focused on the 3 Ps, I think we can look toward outcomes that will achieve more equitable and desirable indications that there is truly, truly a willingness to take advantage of all of the talent that is available and to make sure that that talent finds an important seat at the table.
So in my years, both being on the board of a public company and a president of a bank, I'll add this, that how important board leadership is. You will find that boards that truly have leadership, that they're way ahead on this issue. Okay, they're trying to work on solutions. But I find that boards where you don't find true leadership on the board, and there isn't a CEO that recognizes that and sort of pulls the board forward, that those are the challenges that I think we're facing today. So listen, I want to thank you both for taking the time. This is a very important topic. It's a topic that we can't stop with this discussion today. It has to keep going, and hopefully there'll be opportunities for both of you and as well as me to keep this conversation going. But I wanted to thank you for taking the time. This is an important part of the series, obviously, and it's very appreciated that you guys would both offer such great insight into this challenge that we have.
Thank you. Appreciate
Thanks.
the opportunity.
Very much. Thank you.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.